Sex is a currency that buys prosperity for some, it buys pleasure, and it buys posterity through procreation. That sounds very poetic, doesn't it? So we should not underestimate sex. Can you imagine an activity that gives you prosperity, that gives you pleasure, and also gives you posterity? Abasika, those who will live after you. Sex is powerful. Some of our programming that we say safe sex, and Dr. Kware will remember zero grazing. Zero grazing worked when people were seeing others dying, when the epidemic was in your face. Today, when is the last time any of you walked in the streets and saw someone with end-stage AIDS? It's not there. Thank God it's not there. So it's a currency that is used not just by commercial sex workers, because sometimes sex is a currency, it means you are selling sex. Not at all. The general population also uses sex as a very powerful currency. Married couples use it, and I don't mean literally cash, but it's a very powerful currency. It's been there since before organized religion and most civilization. The exchange rate, you got exchange dollars. The exchange rate of sex varies, but there will always be buyers. I guarantee you, there will always be buyers. And it's something we rarely talk about. Very rarely, especially with our children. I remember our daughter coming to our bedroom once to ask, she wanted to sleep in our bedroom with us. And we told her no. She was around 8 or 10. And so she went back and spoke to her older brothers. And I think they told her that, mommy and daddy have sex. I don't know what they explained, but they probably told her that. So she came back to us, got her mattress, and said, okay, I've gone to my room. Then as she got to the door, said, good night, daddy and mommy. Have fun. She was 8 or 10. We don't want to talk about sex. But if we are going to be sustainable in our efforts for HIV prevention, especially for young people, we are going to reboot our computers and find ways to talk about sex so that we can influence safe sex. Let me give you this challenge. Please don't do it now, because I want you to listen to me. But after the talk, go to YouTube. I'm sure you all have smartphones. Go to YouTube and put in the search Senga, 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 which means aunt. Usually aunt who gives advice on sex. Put it in YouTube and see what you get. And you'll start having an understanding of what young people are watching, what kind of information they are getting, how sex is being glorified. Please don't go to that site just now, because you may stop listening to me. So this is an important message. It's a difficult message, because culturally and from a religious standpoint and even politically, this is an issue that has been difficult to talk about all these years. And yet we have to find a way to talk about it. So, test and treat, another magic bullet. And there's no doubt that antiretrovirals have been a game changer. And theoretically, if everyone is on treatment who's HIV positive, everyone will live and there will be no new infections. But there are massive challenges. And this illustrates many of those challenges and is required reading for anyone who wants to push to 95, 95, 95. And the challenges are greatest in the youngest. The challenges are greatest in the key populations. And yet these two categories are probably the most sexually active. For the older people like me, adherence is good, viral load is good, but sexual activity probably not very impressive. But the young ones and the key populations who are having probably the most sex are also the ones who have the poorest results. And this is something that we need to resolve. Otherwise, it's not going to be a magic bullet. And let's remember that test and treat requires lifelong treatment, but we also forget that it requires lifelong use of the health system. Every month or every 3 months, you have to go to the health system. And so the health system has to adapt that your customers are there, many of them, and for life, so that we are able to implement test and treat. And interestingly, drugs used to be the greatest challenge. Edagala, 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 edagala. Today, drugs are the easiest and the cheapest part of most antiretroviral programs. We can have a debate on that, but I assure you, drugs are not the hardest part. When I was director of IDI and we had 100,000 people on treatment, the issues were not about the drugs. They were about other issues. There's a whole list of them. And we need to understand why there are challenges with supply chain logistics, why laboratory monitoring is more expensive than the drugs, what are the impact on the Ministry of Health, on human resource and on other health conditions, challenges with drug adherence, and now, increasingly, healthcare providers who spend more time collecting data in order to meet the requirements of PEPFAR or Global Fund than they actually spend with the patients. Because they should be with the patient, trying to encourage them to take their drugs and so on, but they spend 5 minutes doing that and 10 minutes entering the data. We need to figure that one out, because it will be a self-fulfilling prophecy that we will end up with poor outcomes. A quick slide on circumcision and antiretroviral therapy. Studies in Rakai are clearly showing a dividend for men, especially. That men's incidence has dropped remarkably compared to women, and is making this gender difference of who is benefiting most from HIV programs. And soon, we are going to be getting long-acting PrEP, probably in the next 2 to 3 years, where a woman could access an injectable pre-exposure prophylaxis that works for 3 to 6 months, or a microbicide ring. Soon. That's the only tool that will correct this dividend where men seem to be benefiting more from HIV prevention than women. But in any strategy, we need to know our risks. If we are going to be sustainable, we need to map our risks. We need to understand our risks. And I've talked about many of them already. Let me just recap a few. Poor drug adherence, loss to follow-up, and drug resistance is a huge risk. Already in Uganda, 10% of HIV positives are on second-line therapy. 10% are on second line. Second line is more complex, is more expensive, is difficult to task shift, more difficult to task shift than first line. Clearly, health systems are getting overloaded. And so the need to fund health systems more, the need to develop health systems that are designed for chronic care. And one of the biggest risks I'm seeing is that our response today seems to be de-emphasizing the role of communities and the role of people living with HIV and AIDS. Yet these are the biggest influencers of behavior and practice in the community. This performance by Turbocharge was very moving. It's going to be very hard for Turbocharge to get money out of PEPFAR or Global Fund to do that campaign countrywide, because the guidelines for funding are much tighter and they don't seem to recognize activities like people living with HIV and AIDS giving their testimonies, or drama groups talking about. They don't seem to. In my day they did, but these days it doesn't seem to be a priority, yet it is a priority. So for the donors, we need to revisit what activities should be funded. Yes, funding civil society and CBOs and organizations of people living with HIV and AIDS is not as straightforward as funding IDI or government of Uganda. Yes, it's messy sometimes, but it's essential. It's a priority. And this, if we don't do this, we will just end up to where we were before. So I have 3 or 4 slides more and I'm done. I'm glad that we had this really, really moving personal testimony from the Queen Mother. Because my slide is asking new blood, new thinking, new ideas. If you look at myself, Gideon, Major Baramira, Sam Okware, we are all over 60. We are all over 60. We need young people. We need young voices to speak out. And with respect, Queen Mother, you are not young either. We need the young ones to come up, and we need to support them. Are we listening to our children? Because our children have very different viewpoints on HIV. Are we listening to our Bazukulu? What about the voices of key populations? Do they matter? Why is the profession of HIV counselor a dying profession? If you are just an HIV counselor now, you are going to struggle to find a job because it's not deemed as important. Nurse counselor, yes, but plain old counselor, dying profession. Why are organizations of people living with HIV and AIDS not a funding priority? So these are questions that the young should be asking. And we need a new thinking. Yes, treatment is essential, very important, very critical. But on its own, without these other activities, we perhaps will not be as sustainable as we want to be. But we have to recognize that PEPFAR and Global Fund, with respect to the other donors, but the other donors are also donating the Global Fund, I'm sure. We have to keep them alive. And let's remember, PEPFAR is not a person. There is no human being called Mr. or Mrs. or Miss PEPFAR. PEPFAR is the taxpayers of America and its leadership. And they don't just give handouts for nothing. They have expectations, which we may like or we may not like. And the Global Fund or the Government of Ireland or UK, that's not personal money. That is money from taxpayers who also have expectations of the recipients. How we use those resources for the purpose that we have asked that money, how we provide visibility of results and proper accountability, how we avoid corruption and fraud is a key condition to keeping that money coming and keeping those organizations alive, at least for Uganda. We, as Uganda, need to know how they dance. And they, in turn, need to know how we dance in our response to the epidemic. And if we talk to each other and understand each other, we will get a new dance that is exciting to both. And I'm glad that the PEPFAR coordinator is a good dancer. I saw her here dancing. We should not think that donor money is our right. It's important that we know that this money comes with some conditionalities. We may not like all of them, and we can negotiate some of them. But there are some fundamental ones that if we don't meet them, the flow of that money may diminish. And unless we, as Uganda, has a plan to replace that money, we will go back to those pictures that I showed that we did not like. I hear this term, where are you? Used by young people especially, where are you? Where are you? When young people and other groups are asking the government of Uganda, particularly His Excellency, to stand up and be counted. But I think it's proper that we acknowledge that His Excellency has been at the forefront of the HIV epidemic since 1986. It's important. Without him, we would not be where we are today. And even where His Excellency does not agree with the technocrats, because I've heard His Excellency say he's very suspicious about the efficacy of circumcision. He has not interfered to block. He is able to separate his personal impressions about HIV prevention from allowing the technocrats and experts to do their job. I wish all of us could be like that, because many of us want to impose our personal opinions on what is done. Can we give His Excellency a clap for that, really? For creating the space and then allowing the experts to use that space. Philemon Lutaaya would not have had the space to be an activist if it were not for the political leadership. And government of Uganda direct investment in HIV is actually estimated at about $100 million per year, which is substantial, but still $500 million short. The challenge is, how do we grow that? So, clearly, moving forward, transitioning and integrating with government will be important, but who will be left out? Because our response has involved a lot of NGOs that are foreign funded. If sustainability is to be mainly domestic funding, what about the work that those NGOs are doing? In particular, the work that often NGOs are working with key populations, because government finds it difficult legally to do that. And so we need to be sure that in sustaining our response, in transitioning a lot of the response to government, we don't leave out NGOs and CBOs, and we don't leave out the response to key populations, because, as I've said, we will not have sustainability if we do that. So my second last slide is to challenge us. The topic is sustainability. Is it just sustaining current efforts, or is it going beyond current efforts? Because from my talk, it's clear that we are not yet at epidemic control. To get to epidemic control, we have to add efforts in prevention, efforts in treatment, efforts in building a health system. All of this is going to take money, it's going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of human resource effort. And so it's not just sustaining what we are currently doing. It's actually a challenge that is far bigger than just sustaining. So, my last slide. If Philemon Lutaaya was alive today, what would he sing? You know, there's this picture on the right especially showing Philemon giving his testimony at Makerere. What would he sing? Which song would he sing? The most famous song by Philemon Lutaaya is Alone and Frightened. So I went back to the lyrics to see whether Philemon would still sing that song. And I will read you some of the lyrics. So it's Alone and Frightened. 30 years later, we are not so alone. You can see this room is filled. So we are not so alone, but we are frightened, because if the funding for the epidemic goes away, we are going to go back to where we are. But here are some of the other things that Philemon put in that song. Today is me, tomorrow someone else. Well, we have 50,000 new infections. That's someone else. Give me love. Give me hope. Don't desert me. Don't reject me. All I need is love and understanding. These lyrics were addressed against stigma. And there continue to be many groups who are HIV positive who are stigmatized. So that message continues to be relevant. He continues, we'll lead the struggle. We won't bow down. We will fight together. We've got to stand up and fight. We'll shed a light in the fight against HIV, AIDS. A recognition that the battle is not over. That we need to continue fighting together. That we fight the virus. That we don't fight people who are either at risk or people with HIV and AIDS. And the song continues, we'll save some lives. We'll save the children of the world. Let's be open. Advise the young ones. A new generation to protect and love. Clearly he knew that young people, especially young girls, were very much at risk in the epidemic, and there was need to strengthen our efforts in addressing them. And finally, break the barriers. Let's stand out and speak out to the world. Philemon Lutaaya stood out. He stood out at great personal cost and spoke out to the world. We have a duty, even as we talk of sustainability, to talk to the world. Even if we don't agree with each other, we need to reach a point where we agree to disagree for the sake of making the world's AIDS-free for our children and our grandchildren and those to come. Thank you. Thank you very much.